Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Because to really grasp how 13 totally disjointed colonies decided to suddenly take on the most powerful empire on Earth, we actually have to step back. We need to look at the unintended consequences of empire building. I want you to picture a chaotic flashback. European powers are fiercely racing across the ocean, completely obsessed with discovering New World gold and claiming massive, massive amounts of territory. Now that frantic land grab, specifically the violent clash between the British and the French over North American land during the 7 Years' War, well, that wasn't just a military victory for Britain. It was actually the financial trap that ultimately doomed their rule in America. It leads us straight to the root of this entire conflict.
60 million pounds. Just think about that number for a second. That was the staggering, absolutely massive debt Great Britain racked up while winning that war. And a huge chunk of that money was spent directly protecting the American colonies from the French. So this sets up the ultimate clash of perspectives, right? The British government essentially looks at their empty bank accounts, then looks over at the colonists and sees a completely fair bill for security services rendered. In their minds, they paid to protect the colonies, and now, well, it was time to pay them back. But the colonists? They definitely didn't see a fair bill. They saw an unconstitutional shakedown.
So, what follows is this grueling, escalating cycle of economic warfare. It wasn't just one single tax that caused the rebellion. It was this deeply frustrating tit-for-tat dynamic that represented a massive, systemic failure of policy. The British try the Stamp Act, slapping a tax on paper. The colonists react with fierce boycotts until the British are forced to repeal it. Okay, so then the British try import duties on everyday items, glass, lead, paper, tea. And again, the colonists boycott, hitting British businesses right where it hurts, in the wallet. The crazy thing is, every single time the British tried to tighten their grip and assert control, they inadvertently unified those disjointed colonies through these shared, passionate boycotts.
Now, we often remember the Boston Massacre as a tragic escalation from snowballs to gunshots, but its real significance, it functioned as an absolute masterclass in colonial propaganda, and literally started as a chaotic street brawl with heckling and snowballs, escalated to rocks and oyster shells, and tragically ended with panicked soldiers firing into the crowd, killing 5 civilians. It was undoubtedly a tragedy, but the Patriot press immediately weaponized it. They took this messy, confusing riot and strategically framed it as a cold-blooded, completely unprovoked slaughter. And that reframing, it caused fury across the colonies to absolutely skyrocket. It radicalized the public in a way that just complaining about taxes never ever could.
By December of 1773, the colonists were still furious about the one remaining tax on tea. So the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves, marched right down to Boston Harbor, and chucked nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea directly into the water. The British response to this Boston Tea Party was absolute vengeance. But honestly, it was also a massive strategic blunder. They dissolved the Massachusetts General Assembly, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 heavily armed troops to occupy Boston. They essentially tried to make a terrifying example out of Massachusetts. But instead, they just proved the Patriots' point that the Crown was acting as a tyrant.
So the other colonies are watching Boston get completely locked down, and they quickly realize, hey, we could easily be next. That fear pushes them to gather in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They assemble a brain trust of extraordinary thinkers. You've got brilliant lawyers like John Adams and John Jay, experienced military men like George Washington, and fiery orators like Patrick Henry. And there's an incredible irony to this specific moment. Some of the greatest legal and strategic minds of the 18th century are gathered in one room, and their grand revolutionary solution after days of bitter debate, they simply decided to write a polite letter of complaint to the British. It really highlights just how reluctant they actually were to start a full-blown war. But, of course, asking nicely inevitably didn't work, so local militiamen started arming themselves. When British troops marched toward Concord to destroy rebel supplies, it set up an incredibly tense face-off at Lexington right at sunrise. Somebody shot first, and what followed was a massive paradigm shift. This was the exact moment political theory and protests transformed into kinetic, bloody reality. Initially, the rebels fell back, but Patriot militiamen just kept pouring in from the surrounding countryside, and the standoff completely flipped. The psychological shock of that morning literally cannot be overstated. The most professional, feared military machine in the entire world was embarrassingly forced to flee all the way back to Boston under constant, heavy fire from everyday farmers and shopkeepers.
Now, don't get the wrong idea. The reality of this early rebellion wasn't some well-oiled machine of noble patriots working in perfect harmony. It was actually a messy, disorganized clash of massive egos. Up in New York, the colonists desperately needed weapons, so Colonel Bennett Arnold heads to Fort Ticonderoga to capture their guns. Only problem, he runs right into Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, who had the exact same plan. Instead of executing a coordinated military strike, these two grown men literally stood there bickering over who was actually in charge, right up until Allen's men threatened to just pack up and go home. Arnold was forced to concede, and yeah, they successfully raided the sleeping fort, but it perfectly illustrates just how fragile and fractured the early Patriot forces really were.
With the colonies now in open, undeniable rebellion, they finally realized they needed a proper, unified army, which meant they needed a commander-in-chief. And this next anecdote is just fantastic. George Washington famously played the humble card during the Continental Congress. He acted completely surprised and deeply honored that they would even consider him for such a monumental role. Yet, this was actually a brilliant piece of nonverbal self-promotion. He had literally been showing up to these civilian meetings wearing his flashy military uniform every single day for the last 10 months. It just goes to show that even the legendary founding fathers had to play politics and heavily posture for power.
Back in Boston, the British attempted to break the siege by taking the high ground at Bunker Hill. Now, the Continentals repelled them twice before finally running out of ammo and retreating. So yes, technically, the British won the hill. But here's the crucial point. They suffered nearly 1,000 casualties compared to the Continentals' 400. This is the ultimate textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory. The colonists may have lost the real estate, but they absolutely won the psychological war. They proved to the world they weren't just an unorganized mob, they could stand toe-to-toe with the empire and really bleed them. This brings us to a really massive turning point in our explainer, because it's so easy to look back now and assume total independence was always the goal from day one. But human nature fears the unknown. Despite inflicting those massive casualties at Bunker Hill, there was a glaring cognitive dissonance hovering over the Continental Congress. I mean, they were in a full-blown war. People were dying, armies were clashing, yet many in Congress still weren't fighting for independence. The vast majority of them still actually considered themselves loyal British subjects. They were shooting at the king's army while simply wanting to repair their relationship and drop the harsh taxes.
They went so far as to send a letter directly to the king, the Olive Branch petition. They were essentially asking, hey, can we remove the taxes and be friends again? But King George's reaction was the catalyst that finally forced America's hand. He was entirely past the point of negotiation and absolutely refused to even read the thing. He viewed them as ungrateful subjects in open revolt and vowed to use the full might of his military to crush the rebellion. So ironically, the king's own fury and ego essentially did the radicalizing work for the Patriots. The window for any sort of peaceful resolution slammed shut forever.
120,000 pounds. That is the sheer weight of the artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga that Washington desperately needed to break the stalemate in Boston. Imagine hauling that, dragged by oxen for 2 brutal months across 300 miles of harsh winter terrain, right to Washington's army. It proves that wars aren't just won with shooting, they are won with sheer logistical willpower. Working quietly through the night, they set these massive guns up on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. When dawn broke, the British woke up, looked up the hill, and realized they were completely exposed. It was a brilliant, bloodless checkmate that forced the British to entirely abandon the city. While Washington shifted his forces to New York, the public narrative underwent a radical transformation. The conversation finally shifted away from just complaining about taxes toward total independence. And Thomas Paine was the vital bridge here between elite political thought and everyday public opinion. His pamphlet, Common Sense, functioned a lot like viral media does today. He took high-minded Enlightenment philosophy and translated it into plain, tavern-level English. It openly advocated breaking away completely, and the idea spread like wildfire. It brought the concept of a brand-new, independent nation straight into the mainstream.
So, with the public now fully on board, Congress went all in. Thomas Jefferson drafted the official Declaration of Independence, and it was far more than just a political breakup letter. It was a powerful ideological weapon. By boldly asserting that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, they fundamentally changed the entire purpose of the war. They turned a local tax dispute over unrepresented wealth into a grand, universal crusade for human rights and self-governance. This elevated rhetoric was absolutely essential for eventually getting foreign allies, like France, to take them seriously and join their cause.
But we have to pause here, because at the exact moment Thomas Jefferson penned the immortal phrase, "All men are created equal,"
He personally held over 100 human beings in bondage. It is a stark, uncomfortable historical contradiction that is absolutely essential to note. This profound hypocrisy was embedded right at the founding of the nation. The American ideal was born flawed, showing us that the equality they were declaring had massive, tragic limitations in actual practice. It set up a foundational contradiction that would eventually take a devastating civil war to address.
Moving forward to July 2nd, Congress voted unanimously for independence, and on July 4th, it officially went into effect. The United States of America was born. And the profound symbolism of what happened next in New York, it really cannot be overstated. Citizens literally tore down a massive, imposing statue of King George III and melted the metal down to create 42,000 musket balls. Think about that. They didn't just declare independence on paper, they took the physical manifestation of the monarchy itself and turned it into weapons to kill his soldiers. It was the ultimate point of no return. King George, of course, retaliated immediately, and he sent a terrifyingly massive force straight to New York. 130 warships and 25,000 professional soldiers. The existential dread here was very, very real. To the British, you have to understand, this wasn't a war between two sovereign nations. It was a police action against treasonous criminals. The Founding Fathers weren't just risking losing a war. They were literally risking the hangman's noose. Washington now had to figure out how to take his newly formed, completely amateur army and somehow defend against the most powerful military machine on the entire planet. Which leads us to the Battle of Brooklyn, and it provided a brutal reality check. Passion and written declarations simply don't deflect bullets. When the British attacked, the Americans fired at a decoy, while the main British force quietly marched around to flank them from behind. Professional military tactics completely dismantled amateur enthusiasm. The Americans were outsmarted, they panicked, and they suffered extremely heavy casualties. They suddenly found themselves backed right up against the river, completely trapped between the British army and the water, staring total annihilation in the face with absolutely no obvious way out. The British had them dead to rights, but instead of attacking and ending the revolution right then and there, they paused to dig in for a siege. And that night, under the cover of a miraculously thick fog, a totally shattered American army managed to evacuate across the river, slipping entirely away in the dark. The British had the rebellion cornered, but let them slip right through their fingers. So how exactly does a battered, near-dead rebellion rise from the ashes of Brooklyn to actually defeat a global superpower? Well, that is a story for next time. Keep exploring and never stop asking questions about the history that shaped our world.